About most surrogacy agencies quote you somewhere between $80,000 and $150,000. But here's what nobody tells you until you're already locked in. The IVF costs alone can add another $30,000 to $50,000 on top of that. And I'm about to show you exactly where that money goes. Because if you don't know these 7 expenses up front, you're going to be blindsided when the bills start rolling in. So you've made the decision. You're going the surrogacy route. You've talked to agencies, you've seen the price breakdowns, and you think you've got your budget figured out. But then the IVF process starts, and suddenly there are charges showing up that weren't in any of those initial consultations. Today we're breaking down the 7 IVF expenses that agencies either forget to mention or completely leave out of their initial quotes. And trust me, these aren't small line items. We're talking about costs that can completely derail your financial planning if you're not ready for them. Here's the thing about surrogacy agencies. They want to get you in the door. So when they give you that initial quote, they're usually showing you the best case scenario. 1 embryo transfer, first attempt successful, no complications, everything goes perfectly. But the reality of IVF is messier than that. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the success rate for IVF using fresh embryos from a donor egg is around 56% for women under 35. That means there's almost a 50-50 chance you're going to need more than 1 attempt. And every single attempt comes with costs that start adding up fast. The problem is that most intended parents don't find out about these extra expenses until they're already deep into the process. You've already signed contracts, you've already paid agency fees, you've already committed to your surrogate, and then your fertility clinic hands you a bill for something you never saw coming. I've seen couples who budgeted $120,000 end up spending close to $180,000, and the majority of that extra $60,000 came from IVF costs they didn't know existed. Let's start with expense number 1, genetic testing upgrades. Now, most agencies will tell you about basic genetic screening. That's usually included in the initial IVF package. But what they don't tell you is that basic screening only tests for a limited number of conditions. We're talking about the most common chromosomal abnormalities like Down syndrome. But there are over 400 genetic disorders that advanced screening can detect. Tests like expanded carrier screening can check both you and your egg donor or sperm donor for recessive genetic conditions that could affect your baby. This isn't included in standard packages, and it costs between $1,000 and $3,000 per person tested. If you're using an egg donor, that's another person to test. If you're concerned about specific genetic conditions that run in your family, you might need even more specialized testing. Pre-implantation genetic testing for monogenic disorders, that's PGTM, can test for specific inherited conditions like cystic fibrosis or sickle cell disease. That test alone runs between $4,000 and $8,000 per cycle. And here's the kicker. Most insurance plans don't cover this because they consider it elective. So right off the bat, you could be looking at an extra $5,000 to $10,000 just in genetic testing. Expense number 2, embryo storage fees. When you go through IVF, the goal is usually to create multiple embryos. The fertility clinic will retrieve eggs, fertilize them, and hopefully you'll end up with several viable embryos. But here's what agencies don't emphasize. You can only transfer 1 or 2 embryos at a time. So what happens to the rest? They get frozen. And frozen embryos aren't just sitting in a freezer for free. Fertility clinics charge storage fees, and these fees are annual. On average, you're looking at anywhere from $350 to $1,000 per year to keep your embryos frozen. Now you might be thinking, okay, that's not too bad. But consider this. What if your first transfer doesn't work? What if you want to have more than 1 child? Those embryos could be in storage for years. According to data from the American Society for Reproductive Medicine, the average intended parent keeps embryos frozen for 3 to 5 years. Let's do the math on that. If you're paying $600 per year and you keep embryos frozen for 4 years, that's $2,400 you probably didn't budget for. And if you're paying closer to that $1,000 mark, you're looking at $4,000 just for storage. Some clinics also charge a one-time freezing fee on top of the annual storage cost. This can be anywhere from $500 to $1,500. And if you decide you don't want to keep the embryos anymore, some clinics even charge disposal fees. I've heard of clinics charging up to $500 just to dispose of embryos you don't want. It sounds ridiculous, but it's real. Expense number 3, medication overages. Every IVF cycle requires a ton of medication. We're talking about hormones to stimulate egg production, hormones to prepare the uterus, hormones to support early pregnancy. When agencies give you a quote, they usually estimate medication costs based on an average cycle. But here's the problem. Not everyone responds to medication the same way. Some surrogates need higher doses, some need longer treatment periods, some need completely different medication protocols if the first one doesn't work. The average cost of IVF medications is between $3,000 and $5,000 per cycle. But I've seen cases where medication costs went up to $8,000 or even $10,000 because the surrogate needed extended treatment. Certain medications like Lupron, Follistatin, and Menopur can cost hundreds of dollars per dose. And if your surrogate needs to be on these medications for longer than expected, those costs skyrocket. Insurance coverage for fertility medications is also extremely limited. Even if you have good insurance, most plans put a lifetime cap on fertility drug coverage. That cap is usually around $10,000 to $15,000. Once you hit that cap, every single medication after that is 100% out of pocket. Then there's the issue of medication waste. Fertility medications often come in specific doses, but what if your surrogate only needs 3/4 of a vial? You still have to buy the full vial and the rest goes to waste. Clinics can't reuse opened medication, so you're paying for medicine that never even gets used. Over the course of multiple cycles, this waste can add up to thousands of dollars. Expense number 4, monitoring appointments and blood work. During an IVF cycle, your surrogate needs to be monitored constantly. We're talking about ultrasounds every few days, blood tests to check hormone levels, sometimes multiple appointments per week. Each one of these monitoring appointments costs money. A single ultrasound can cost anywhere from $200 to $600 depending on where you live. Blood work for hormone testing runs between $100 and $300 per test. Now multiply that by the number of appointments needed. During the stimulation phase alone, a surrogate might need 5 to 8 ultrasounds and 10 to 15 blood tests. Let's say each ultrasound is $400 and each blood test is $200. That's $3,200 for ultrasounds and $3,000 for blood work. We're already at over $6,000 just for monitoring, and that's just one cycle. If the first transfer doesn't work and you have to do another cycle, you're paying for all of that again. What makes this even more frustrating is that monitoring costs are often listed separately from the IVF package price. The clinic will tell you the cycle costs $12,000, but then monitoring is billed separately. And if your surrogate lives far from the fertility clinic, there might be additional coordination fees. Some surrogates have to travel to the clinic for monitoring, and while travel expenses are usually covered, the appointment fees still add up. I've talked to intended parents who spent over $15,000 on monitoring alone across multiple cycles. Expense number 5, failed transfer fees. This is the one that really catches people off guard. When you do an embryo transfer, there's always a chance it won't work. The embryo might not implant. The pregnancy test might come back negative. And when that happens, you have to do another transfer. But here's what agencies do not make clear. You're paying for that entire cycle all over again. Yes, you might already have frozen embryos from the first cycle, so you don't have to do another egg retrieval. But you still have to pay for the frozen embryo transfer cycle, and those aren't cheap. A frozen embryo transfer cycle typically costs between $3,000 and $6,000. That includes thawing the embryo, preparing the surrogate's uterus with medications, the actual transfer procedure, and all the monitoring that goes along with it. According to the Society for Assisted Reproductive Technology, the average success rate for frozen embryo transfers is about 50 to 60%, depending on the age of the eggs used. That means there's a very real chance you'll need multiple transfers. If you need 3 transfers before one is successful, and each transfer costs $5,000, that's $15,000 you probably didn't account for. Some clinics offer shared risk or multi-cycle programs where you pay a flat fee up front that covers multiple attempts. These programs can provide some financial protection, but they're not available everywhere, and they come with strict eligibility requirements. Plus, they're expensive up front, often $30,000 to $40,000. If you don't have that kind of cash available at the beginning of your journey, you're stuck paying per cycle and hoping for the best. Expense number 6, egg or sperm donor fees beyond the initial selection. If you're using an egg donor or sperm donor, you know there are costs involved. But what most people don't realize is that the initial donor fee is just the beginning. Let's say you choose an egg donor. You pay her compensation, which is typically $10,000 to $15,000. But then there are agency fees on top of that, which can be another $5,000 to $10,000. Then there are legal fees to draft the donor contract, which is another $1,000 to $3,000. Then there are medical screening fees for the donor, psychological evaluation fees, travel expenses if the donor has to travel to the clinic. All of these add up. But here's where it gets really expensive. What if the egg retrieval doesn't produce enough viable eggs? What if the embryos don't develop properly? What if you need to do a second egg retrieval with the same donor or find a new donor altogether? Every time you go through a donor cycle, you're paying all of those fees again. I've seen intended parents go through 2 or 3 egg donor cycles before they get enough quality embryos, and each cycle costs them an additional $20,000 to $30,000. Sperm donation is usually less expensive, typically $1,000 per vial. But you often need multiple vials. If the first IVF cycle doesn't work, you need more sperm for the next attempt. If you want to have multiple children, you need to buy extra vials to ensure they're genetically related. And here's something most people don't think about. Sperm banks don't hold vials for you indefinitely. If your chosen donor runs out of available vials, you might have to switch donors, which can be emotionally difficult and means your children might not be genetically related. Expense number 7, embryo rebiopsy and refreezing fees. Let's say you create embryos and have them genetically tested. Some of those embryos come back normal, which is great, but sometimes the test results are inconclusive. The lab might tell you they couldn't get a clear reading. When that happens, you have the option to rebiopsy the embryo, which means thawing it, taking another cell sample, refreezing it, and testing again. Each of these steps costs money. Rebiopsy fees typically run between $1,000 and $2,000 per embryo. Refreezing adds another few $100s. And if you have multiple embryos that need retesting, those costs multiply fast. I know a couple who had 4 embryos come back with inconclusive results. They decided to rebiopsy all 4 because they wanted to be absolutely sure before transferring. The rebiopsy and refreezing cost them over $7,000. Then there's the issue of embryo quality degradation. Every time an embryo is frozen and thawed, there's a small risk of damage. Some embryos don't survive the thaw. If an embryo doesn't survive, you've just lost that potential chance at pregnancy, and you might need to create more embryos, which means going through another full IVF cycle with all the costs that entails. So let's add this all up. Advanced genetic testing, $5,000 to $10,000. Embryo storage fees over several years, $2,000 to $4,000. Medication over ages, $3,000 to $5,000. Extra monitoring appointments, $5,000 to $15,000. Failed transfer fees, $5,000 to $15,000. Additional donor cycles, $10,000 to $30,000. Embryo rebiopsy and refreezing, $2,000 to $7,000. On the low end, we're talking about an extra $32,000. On the high end, we're looking at $86,000. And remember, these are just the IVF-related costs. This doesn't include agency fees, surrogate compensation, legal fees, insurance, or any of the other major expenses that come with surrogacy. This is why it's so important to go into this process with your eyes wide open. I'm not trying to scare you away from surrogacy. For many people, it's the only way to have a biological child, and it's absolutely worth it. But you need to be financially prepared for the reality of what this costs. Don't just accept the initial quote from an agency and assume that's all you'll pay. Dig deeper. Ask specifically about IVF costs. Ask about what happens if the first transfer fails. Ask about medication overages and monitoring fees. Ask about everything we just talked about. The bottom line is this: surrogacy agencies aren't necessarily trying to hide these costs from you, but they're in the business of making surrogacy seem achievable, and talking about worst-case scenarios doesn't help them sign clients. It's up to you to ask the hard questions and plan for the possibilities that no one wants to talk about. Create a budget that includes a cushion for these unexpected expenses. Most financial advisors who specialize in family building suggest adding at least 30% to whatever initial quote you receive. If an agency tells you surrogacy will cost $100,000, plan for at least $130,000. Better to overestimate and have money left over than to run out of funds halfway through the process. Talk to your fertility clinic directly. Don't just rely on what the agency tells you. Get an itemized breakdown of every possible IVF-related cost. Ask about their success rates and what percentage of intended parents need multiple transfer cycles. Ask if they offer any kind of multi-cycle discount or shared risk program. Get everything in writing so there are no surprises later. And most importantly, connect with other intended parents who have been through this. Join surrogacy support groups online. Read blogs and forums where people share their real experiences and real costs. The surrogacy community is incredibly open about sharing this information because everyone knows how overwhelming the financial side of this journey can be. Learn from other people's experiences so you don't have to learn the hard way. If this helped you, hit subscribe for more surrogacy real talk.